Welcome to On My Way to Wealth, the podcast where busy Gen Xers can learn financial tips as they navigate life on their way to wealth. And now, please join your host, Luis Rosa.
Welcome to another episode of On My Way to Wealth. My name is Luis, and I'm your host. Happy 2025. Thank you very much for tuning in. I want to talk about tariffs, which is probably a buzzword that you've been hearing a lot about, especially now with the new incoming administration in the White House. President Trump has talked about just basically imposing tariffs on several different nations. And I just want to talk to you about what they are, how they work, who pays for them, and what impact they can have on your personal finances so that you have a really good idea how they operate. So I'll do my best not to get too jargonish on you and just basically tell you in very simple terms what they are. So let's talk about it. What is a tariff? So let me show you how that works. Think about when you buy a product that is not made in the United States. It has to be imported from wherever it comes from, right? So let's say you buy an electronic cell phone, for example, that is made in China, wherever, right? That company exports that to the United States, so they ship it over. When it gets to customs, there is a certain tariff that has to be paid to the US government, right? So if I live in the US and I'm a small business or a big business and I import goods, products, parts, whatever it is from another country, when I go to customs to pick it up, there is a tariff, is a fee. In essence, it's a tax that I have to pay for that. And then I can take it with me, put it in my warehouse, and then distribute it and sell it however I please to my consumers, right? So here's what happens. If I am importing something, I'm in the United States and I'm importing a good, and now that good just became more expensive, well, the cost of doing business for me just rose, right? Which means that my profits are lower if I keep everything the same. So as a result, what I need to do to make money, right, and make it profitable is to then pass that cost along to my consumer ultimately. So if something costs me $5 more now to import, I may just raise my prices, right? It's what makes sense. Typically, that's the way it works, right? So when you hear that a tariff is going to be imposed on something, then think of it's a new tax that the importer has to pay, and ultimately they're going to pass that cost down to us, me as the consumer, right? Now, they serve a purpose because tariffs, we have people that argue that they help protect a local industry, which is true. It makes sense. So if you're thinking about, something that gets made in China versus something that gets made in the US, if we put a very high tariff on something that comes from China, then the product that's made in the US may look more attractive because maybe even though it's made in the US and the people that make it pay for higher wages and so on, maybe the tariffs are so high that it's still more competitive to buy it here, right? So it does serve a purpose. But if we increase them and make them too high, then we run the risk of the other nations retaliating in kind, because you have to think about the flip side of that. If I'm an exporter from China or Mexico and I'm sending goods to the US and all of a sudden there's a tax on them, my product just became less attractive to the US consumer. So now I get less demand, most likely, right? So it's going to hurt me as well. So what am I going to do as a country? I may say, hey, you know what? We're going to do the same game you're doing, and we're going to do a retaliatory tariff on American imports that come to our country. The US exports a lot of things too. So if that happens, now all of a sudden, it became more expensive for US producers to send things overseas, right? So if you see that connection, basically, tariffs do serve a role in keeping a local domestic industry from competition from outside. But if done to an extreme, then it may actually hurt the US economy overall, because there will be a tax that consumers will ultimately have to pay via the price, right? And that also hurts the businesses that are trying to export into other countries, right? So, they're a good tool for negotiating, but ultimately, if prices go up, then that's going to raise the prices on things overall, right? Because as these importers basically pass the cost along to us, then that can have a ripple effect on the prices of a lot of things. And therefore, inflation can go back up. Now, we've been hearing about inflation for a very long time, which definitely came as a result of the pandemic, with supply chain issues and all kinds of stuff that created prices to go up, right? And also like the government spending with stimulus and all that. Ultimately, that also created inflation. So we're still dealing with high inflation, and you have noticed how things are more expensive, right? Particularly groceries. That was a hot topic during the presidential debates and all that. So if tariffs are in fact imposed at an extreme level to other countries and they retaliate, overall things are just going to become more expensive, and then the problem of inflation isn't really going to go away. Now, here's what happens. You may have heard of the Federal Reserve, which is also known as the Fed. It's the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. Their job is to basically perform many different functions to help with the U.S. economy as much as they can. One of the roles that they play is trying to keep inflation tamed. And they usually have a metric that they try to keep inflation somewhere around 2.5% or something like that. So one of the tools that they can use is setting interest rates, but it's not the direct interest rate that you think. The Federal Reserve does not set the interest rates for mortgages, car loans, credit cards, none of that stuff. What they set is called the federal funds rate, which is literally a rate that banks charge each other to borrow money from each other overnight. Usually the larger banks that have more money, they lend money to banks that need money, and the Federal Reserve sets that rate, the federal funds rate. So here's what happens. The way that it works economically, basically the Federal Reserve says, okay, prices are too high, inflation is running away, right, rampant. So what we want to do is tame the economy, basically lower economic activity so that prices can come down. One way that they do that is that they raise the federal funds rate. So now if a bank needs to borrow money, but it's costing them a lot more to borrow that money, then in turn, what they're going to do is the same concept with the imports and exporters and the tariffs. They're going to pass that cost along to us, right? So if I am a credit card company like Visa, MasterCard, and now my cost of borrowing just went up, well, guess what? Your APR is going to go up. That's the way they do it, right? So when you hear that the Federal Reserve raises rates, it will have an impact ultimately on things like credit cards, also any type of bank loan, and ultimately it may even impact mortgages as well. Specifically, adjustable rate mortgages, 30-year fixed mortgages are usually more directly related with the 10-year U.S. Treasury, but that's another topic for another day. But ultimately, when these banks get their cost of borrowing to go higher, then they pass that cost along to us, right? So if going back to tariffs, if we have higher tariffs on, imported products, and then the countries retaliate and they raise their tariffs, prices are just going to go up. And then the Fed will have one of the tools is to then again raise rates, which we're already at a very high inflationary period as it is, right? So we wouldn't want that to happen. So my hope is that these talks of tariffs are just a negotiating tool of some sort, and that they don't actually get implemented. Because I think ultimately, especially from what I see from other economic experts, is that it's not going to be a good thing overall for the average consumer and the overall economy, including small businesses in the U.S. So what can we do about it as consumers? Obviously, we can't control what the government's going to do, whether the Federal Reserve is going to raise rates or the administration is going to put tariffs on companies and so on, right? We can't control that. But that's why it's so important for you to be in as sound a financial position as you possibly can, right? So we want to make sure that, go back down to the basics, right? That we're budgeting our money, make sure that we're not overspending and we're living within our means. Right now, since it's beginning of the year, it's a great opportunity for you to take a look at what's coming in, what's going out. See if there's any opportunity for you to cut back on anything, maybe change plans on something that might be a cheaper price and so on. So just make sure that you have a really good idea of your household budget. Number two is also making sure that you have a good enough emergency savings, because these types of things, tariffs and all that, I mean, they will ultimately have impacts on companies, right? And that could lead to either some companies in certain industries maybe having layoffs as a result because their costs went up so much and they have less demand for their product. Or it can mean that maybe they don't have enough money to give you a raise as their employee, right? So we want to make sure that we have enough money in case of any type of emergency, including a layoff or maybe not having an increase via your employer, like a salary increase or bonuses and so on, right? We also want to make sure that you invest as well. Once you have your budget and your emergency savings set, make sure that any additional disposable income that you have, that you're putting money away, whether it's in your 401k, retirement plan at work, or investing in IRAs and other types of investments. The reason for that is because if you keep your money in the bank, right now, because inflation is so high, one of the good things about that is that you do see higher yields on things like money markets and high yield savings accounts. So we've gotten used to, in the past couple of years, to have 4%, 4.5% on a high yield savings account. But if you remember back a few years ago, that is not the norm. I remember when banks were paying like 0.01% on your savings, right? It's like a joke. So you want to make sure that ultimately for the long term, you invest, because when you invest, typically, if you look at historically in the stock market, it tends to return an amount that is higher than the rate of inflation, because you want to keep up with the fact that prices over time go up. If you have your money just sitting in the savings, ultimately, as time passes, inflation is going to erode the purchasing power of that money. Think about, 3, 4, 5 years ago, or think 10 years ago, if you can. Compare a price, of anything that you use, whether it's a gallon of gas, gallon of milk, whatever it is, it's probably a lot higher than it was back then, right? So if you had that same amount of money just saved in the bank, it's not worth the same amount today for you to buy that thing, right? So you want to make sure that over time, you're putting your money somewhere that it's keeping up with inflation, and also taxation, right? Because as you have earnings on your savings or investments, you also have to pay taxes on those, right? Which is so important that you speak to a financial advisor to make sure that you look at your specific situation and see what's right for you, right? Doesn't hurt to have a phone call, because there are so many things that you may not know that you don't know. Right. So in closing, just make sure that you have your financial house in order and that you're best prepared for any potential impact that tariffs and interest rates may have on your individual personal finance. So as always, thank you for tuning in. I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions or any topic suggestions for the future, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, luis@onmywaytowealth.com, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening to On My Way to Wealth. If you have any questions, please send me an email at luis@onmywaytowealth.com. The information provided here is for information and education purposes only. The opinions expressed herein are solely those of myself, unless otherwise specifically cited. Material presented is believed to be from reliable sources, and no representations are made by my firm or myself about other parties' information or accuracy or completeness. All information or ideas provided should be discussed in detail with a financial advisor, accountant, or legal counsel prior to implementation. Thank you.